It's an honor to be here at CARVERCON 2019. Excuse me. My name is David Baas, and I will be your sweaty MC for the day. CARVERCON is based upon the CARVER Target Analysis and Vulnerability Assessment Methodology, which was created by the Special Activities Division of the CIA and made popular by the U.S. Special Operations community. If you're not familiar with CARVER, you sure will be by the end of the day. We are surrounded by talented, respected, intellectual, and successful people right here in this room, ready to share their CARVER knowledge. Take, for example, some of the all-star presenters you're going to hear from today. Leo Lebay, the godfather, inventor of CARVER, with over 40 years of military and CIA experience. I better be nice to him, because I'm pretty sure he's already hacked my phone and knows what I'm going to say about him. And I don't want to be sleeping with the fishes. Mr. Luke Bencie worked in over 140 countries, trained thousands of police and military officers on counterterrorism, counterintelligence, and operational surveillance. Author of 4 books, and I don't even know if I've read that many. Dr. Jennifer Hesterman, retired Air Force Colonel, Vice Commander, has escorted presidents, George Washington University, Johns Hopkins University, Air University, Penn State University, doctoral degree, author. What am I doing with my life? Good. It's incredible. I mean, my bio says here, take this ball, snap it between your legs, and go like this. And you did all those things plus more. Amazing. Martin Garcia, Global Security Director for the Western Hemisphere of Mars, Inc. Not like, hey, Martin, you take Florida. Bill, you take Georgia. We're talking Western Hemisphere, people. That's a lot. Chuck Brooks, Leo West, Nicholas Waugh, Vincent Volpi, and Dr. Karen Holbrook, who showed me all her Ohio State stuff on her wrist. Thank you for that. The list is amazing. And there's so many here, and if I forgot anyone else, I apologize. That's because one of 2 reasons. Number 1, I used to smash my head around, basically equivalent to 70 or so minor car crashes per NFL game. Ended up with a few concussions. It's reasonable. Number 2, I watched too many Joe Biden speeches. We all know we're not in Iowa today. All right, all joking aside, I want to thank all of you for coming out today and participating, and I would also like to thank our CARVERCON sponsors. Aston Martin, the official car of James Bond, but also for the 2nd year in a row, a sponsor of CARVERCON. Aston Martin continues to support our men and women who work in the shadows. The Journal of Counterterrorism and Homeland Defense has been around for over 25 years, along with their publishing organization, IACSP. They will be publishing a follow-up article about CARVERCON. Quality of Life Plus, truly an amazing organization when their mission is to foster and generate innovations that aid and support and improve the quality of life for those who have served our country by providing prosthetics for those veterans with unique challenges. Capstan Financial Consulting, let Capstan navigate your financial waters, being Sarasota's financial compass, which ensures that families achieve their goals and ensure their financial future. True Force Police Body Cameras. True Force is a video data logging system designed and built to operate under extreme conditions. Angus McKenzie will be in the lobby for a demonstration of these highly reliable police body camera systems. Now with a presentation of colors, over 15 and a half years active duty, and 3 as a reservist in the United States Marine Corps, currently serving as the Veteran Services Administrator for the USF Office of Veteran Success, Carlos Moreira.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. Today's color guard is brought to you by United States Marine Corps 4th Assault Amphibian Battalion in Tampa, Florida. On top of that, both Marines are also USF students. One of them is in the College of Business, and the other one's in College of Criminology. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the posting of the colors, and also remain standing for the Pledge of Allegiance and the posting of the colors.
Detail, forward. March.
Time. March.
Hold. Left, face. Present, arms.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Ready, two. Face. Ready, post. Right, face. March.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. Now, it is my privilege and my honor to introduce to you the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee Regional Chancellor, Dr. Karen Holbrook.
Thank you, Carlos, and welcome to all of you. I have to say, after David's introduction, I really am humbled to be here. What a distinguished audience and what a distinguished lineup of speakers you have today, and I think it's going to be not only a very interesting day, but also a very important day. I've got to come back to the Ohio State thing. I brought my Ohio State bracelet because he showed me his Super Bowl ring, and I said, a Michigan guy, can't come up with a Super Bowl ring without seeing what's Ohio State done. So anyway, that's the Ohio State thing that David said. So anyway, I want to come back to how really important this is and how truly honored we are to have you here. When I think about what's happened in the last 2 days in this auditorium, last night this was set up with a very different display with beautiful pillars and things and a screen because we had a TEDx conference, or not a conference, but a TEDx program last night where we had 8 TEDx speakers here. And for a little school like this, a small part of the University of South Florida, to have a TEDx program like this was just something very, very special. And then to turn it around and within 24 hours to have all of you here is just amazing for us. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being part of this. There's nothing that's more important than security. And I saw all of the different ways that CARVERCON is working with security. I didn't see higher education and universities listed there, but I know that it is there because there was an ETC at the end, and I know that that's part of it. But it doesn't matter where we are today. We are always thinking about security, whether it's on a small level or whether it's on a large level or whether it's on a global level. And I'll just to say something that why this means a lot to me is that in a week, actually next Friday, week from today, I'll be leaving for Jordan because I'm on a group that's called CDRF Global, and this was an organization that was started after the fall of the Soviet Union to transfer the technology that came out of the military into civilian uses. And so this organization is set up to do research in health security, in nuclear security, and chemical security, and biological security the world over. So seeing it from every single level and how incredibly important it is and how many people are engaged in it is something that I think is very, very important and valuable. So we are honored to have you here at the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee. It's a campus that we're very proud of, and I hope you'll have a chance, I know you'll have a little chance at least, at noon to look around and see what is here. But at any rate, let me just say thanks to every one of you for participating in this and being here. You really do honor us by this program. And Luke, thank you so much for being part of it. And Luke is one of our advisors to the College of Business. So seeing all of you here tells us that this is really going to be a great day. Thank you very much and welcome again.
Pardon me while I find my place. Thank you, Dr. Holbrook, for that warm welcome. Now that the conference is officially opened, let's get down to business and begin discussing national security and critical infrastructure protection. Someone signal for Batman? Someone just as cool as Batman is our first speaker today, who co-wrote the book on CARVERCON. Luke Bencie is the Managing Director of Security Management International. He's been a consultant to the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. Department of Defense, over 24 Fortune 500 companies, as well as foreign governments, as a security specialist for Raytheon and their Intelligence and Information Systems Division, member of the U.S. Department of State for an emergency support team, responsible for immediately responding to terrorist attacks carried out against U.S. targets overseas. Please welcome Luke Bencie.
All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out to our second annual CARVERCON event. Last year we did this in Washington, D.C., and we had a snowstorm right the night before the event. So we said last year, that's it. The next event is going to be in Florida. And originally we were going to do it at Miami. We were actually going to do it at the Doral Country Club down there. And then with our great relationship here that we have with USF and Dr. Holbrook, they said, no, come, let's do it at our facilities here. And we're really glad that we did. And we're really proud and grateful that we have so many first responders who showed up here as well today. So thank you very much for your service and all you do for the community. So let's get started. As Dave mentioned, this conference is all based around the CARVER methodology. And as he said, if you don't know what CARVER is, by the end of the day, you will be intimately familiar with everything CARVER. So let me see. Okay, so I wanted to start off. There was a survey done recently in the New York Times that asked people, are we more safe today in our world, or is the world getting more dangerous? And over 80% of the respondents says no. The world is getting more dangerous each day. We're more nervous about everything that's happening, particularly security-wise. And if you look around, I mean, let's be honest, how often is the flag at half-mast these days because of a school shooting? How often do we hear about a cyber attack where millions of passwords and identities have been stolen? You know, we've got ISIS now, which 10, 15 years ago, we worried about Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is now like the JV team compared to ISIS. We have gang issues. We've got some folks from the gang unit here from Bradenton who know how difficult of a problem that can be. Now we have to start thinking about bioterrorism, about epidemics, about pandemics. And then also, we're going into 2020, and North Korea is still a factor. They're still a player in the world along with Iran and all these other things. So it's funny, every time you go to a security conference, it seems it's always doom and gloom right off the bat. The security guys are always telling you how awful the world is. And if you look at our defense spending budget, so this is this year, 2019, in the United States, we are still by far the largest spender in the world. $643 billion we spend on military and defense. China's next at 168, followed by Saudi Arabia. And then we pretty much make up the next 10 countries equal, if not more so, our military budget. And this is for military. Private sector security now is a $100 billion a year industry. Now, this is non-military related. This is cameras, this is locks, this is your typical security guard systems, and that number by 2025 is supposed to get up to about $184 billion according to MarketWatch. Now, I've spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. I just got back from there last week from being out there a couple months. I was in Saudi when President Trump was out there. And you recall, what was President Trump's first ever international visit? To Saudi Arabia, of course, just as it was for President Obama, President Bush before, and President Clinton. The reason is President Trump went out there and signed a $350 billion deal, arms deal, weapons deal, military, airplanes, everything like that with the Saudis over 10 years. And congressional districts are made up of these defense contractors, what we call the Beltway Bandits up in Washington, D.C. I worked for Raytheon for a while, Leo and Leo West, that we also work for Raytheon and all these companies. And you realize congressional districts, you all have a defense contractor in your district. It's all part of it. So when you have issues in Saudi Arabia where there may be human rights violations, there may be a war going on with Yemen, or there's a Washington Post reporter who's hacked up with a bone saw and his body is dumped into a vat of acid, we don't end our relationship with these countries because it is so important for us to keep going with our spending. So on that note of doom and gloom, we ask the question, is the world more safe today or is it more dangerous today? And I love the quote from Michael Caine in the Batman movie, is that, do some men out there just want to see the world burn? Is it really that bad? Is it doom and gloom? Well, I'm here to tell you today, after 141 countries of traveling, usually 6 to 9 months a year, I'm overseas working in other places. I did my time in the CIA. In fact, I went to Jordan, where Dr. Holbrook mentioned after the bombings in 2005 to go do the 3 hotel bombings out there. So spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm going to tell you here today, you make a decision and tell me if you think the world is more dangerous or it's safer. So what I'd like to do now is step into our time machine and go back to the year of 1988. In 1988, Wall Street was the top movie. Michael Douglas won for Gordon Gekko role, the Academy Award. George Michael's Faith was the #1 album and song out there. And we'll compare it to last year, because we have the full statistics for last year in the U.S. on security. 1988, the Riverview Rams also went to their first state championship. Yeah. I have to mention that. Okay, so in 1988, the homicide rate in the United States was 8.5 people for every 100,000 there was a murder in the United States. 30 years later now, thanks to our boys in blue here, that number's dropped over 30% to 5.3 out of every 100,000 there's a murder. Extreme poverty in the United States was at 12%. 30 years later, we're down to 7%. Pollution, everybody talks about, oh, we're carbon footprints and all of this and that, and tons of waste. Our pollution is down from 35 million tons of waste down to 21 tons. Wars. We had almost double the wars that were going on 30 years ago. 23 wars in the world, now we're down to 12. Autocracies. Autocracies meaning that there was a country that was ruled by one sole ruler, a dictatorship, a monarchy, what have you, non-democratic. 30 years ago, that number, there was 85 countries, we're down to 60. If you just go back a little bit further than that, if you go back to the late 60s, the early 70s, there was only about 30 true democracies on planet Earth. 40 years later, 50 years later, we've got about 130 democracies on planet Earth. In fact, of the countries out there that are non-democratic, 4/5 of the population of those people all live in China. So if you look at now what's going on in Hong Kong with the protests of Hong Kong trying to break away, get their freedom, if the Chinese people, we probably won't see it in our generation, but you never know, if they ever become democratic, that means most of the planet Earth will become a democracy. The nukes. 1988, the Cold War was still going on. There was over 60,000 nukes. Now we're down to 10,000. And the terrorist threat. People who were killed by terrorist attacks in 1988 in Western Europe was 440. You say, well, who was that? If you look back, I think we had the Pan Am bombing in '88. We also had, we still had Western right-wing terrorist groups. We had the Red Army faction. We had Baader-Meinhof gang. They were doing, small bombings and things throughout Western Europe, Germany, and those places. And then last year there was 238. A lot of those would be small bombings, the vehicular terrorism, running people over with cars. And then if we look at you know, we say, oh, we live in a world of social media now. People are getting dumber. We've got the Kardashians. You're at a stoplight, and you're like, what happened? Why this generation is not the same? Well, globally, we are actually getting smarter as a species. Our IQ goes up about 3 points every 10 years. But I think the most important statistic out there is that every year, 137,000 people on this planet, or excuse me, not every day, 137,000 people are lifted out of poverty. And if you've ever been to Africa and you see what poverty is, that's true poverty. I mean, what we see here, if you've got a cell phone and you're calling yourself poor, you know, you have no idea. People drinking out of mud puddles in Africa. So the world, we can thank the news, I think, for sort of our doom and gloom. As the media says, if it bleeds, it leads. But in a lot of sense, the world is actually getting better on a security-wise. And security, it's complex. And there's things that you need to ask yourself in the security world. Is this security solution actually worth the money that it's spending on it? Are the mitigation strategies we're using, are they working, and are the trade-offs worth it? So, I mean, think of TSA. You know, 19 hijackers, September 11th, completely transformed our security system of TSA and the billions, if not trillions of dollars spent for security. Are we safer now on airplanes? You know, I mean, yeah, certainly we are. Did we need to spend that type of money? Was it the right way? I mean, it's sort of the evolution of security. So you really, it's a process. And again, and I'm a security guy. I've been doing this for 20 years now, so I'm not trying to downplay security by any means. But, you know, as Ben Franklin famously said, you know, those who would trade their liberty away for some temporary security deserves neither liberty nor security. So, what am I doing up here? Two obvious questions that anybody in the security industry asks, two questions that any CEO asks, that any police chief asks, that any presidential appointee asks. Is the money that we're spending on security, is it worth it? My answer to that is, it depends. It depends on who the threat is. It depends what your organization is. It depends if it was a smart thought process of the security solution that was implemented. And number two, are we winning? All these adversaries, bad guys out there, are we winning or are they winning? Are the terrorists winning? My answer is no, we're winning. We, the US, we are definitely winning, but I say it with a caveat. And the caveat is that we are now dealing with a more sophisticated adversary than ever before. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. I was out in Saudi when the drones or cruise missiles, whatever exactly they were, that struck Saudi Aramco. Now, if you've been to Saudi Arabia, there's interesting sites. You see Patriot missile batteries that are set up all around the kingdom, around palaces, around critical infrastructure. And what those are is if somebody launches a drone or a missile, those are right there to shoot back. And you see these right on the road. Imagine driving down 41 and seeing Patriot missile batteries, you know, pointed at Cuba or whatever. But that's just a way of life over there. So all these billions of dollars spent by the Saudis to protect them, and 4 drone strikes come in. They knock out the world's oil supply. Forget what the statistic was, 10%, 20% of the world's oil supply. It's still not back online. And they did this right through the net of all these security systems. And you can see the precision of the strikes that were done on them as well, onto the reservoirs there. So so that breaks the point. Our adversaries are much more sophisticated. So they say, oh, the Iranians did it. They launched from southern Iraq. They came with low-flying drones, but they still don't have a complete answer of who exactly did this. So there is a sophistication level, particularly if it's a state sponsor of terrorism, somebody like in Iran. The next thing is countries like China with hacking. A big part of my business is doing intellectual property theft, is doing corporate espionage. And the Chinese are the greatest offenders by far of hacking. We all know this. This is no surprise to any person in this room. The reason may surprise you how they got to this point, though. In 1986, Deng Xiaoping was the communist leader of China. And back then, China was a struggling country. I mean, they still had a huge population, but they were nowhere near as wealthy as they are today. In 1986, in March of 1986, Deng Xiaoping started the 863 program, which basically said that the Chinese intelligence service and any other apparatus, everyday citizens who even go abroad, they have an obligation to steal and bring back any intellectual property that they can find from any other country, particularly the United States. So if you're wondering how is it that China basically became a superpower in 30 years in one generation, it's because instead of spending billions of dollars on R&D, they spent millions with their intelligence service just to steal it. They've had tremendous success and continue to do so. So the threat from espionage, particularly from China, will continue, and it's much, much more sophisticated ever than it was 30 years ago. And then the other thing about our adversaries and their sophistication is, you know, when people say, oh, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these groups, even criminal elements these days, you think that they're these dumb criminals, these dumb terrorists. And actually, they're very well organized, they're very well structured. The one thing about terrorists as well is if you want to be a terrorist or start your own terrorist group, the first thing you have to do is have a manifesto or write your own handbook. Every terrorist group, Al-Qaeda has their own training manual for their recruits. You can go to the FBI's website and download it online. It's about 15 chapters of how to conduct surveillance, how to do operational communications, all of these type of things. This chart here is actually, this is a CIA counterterrorism breakdown chart of just how the terrorists go through their operations. And as you can see, they decide on their operation here, they select their targets, they begin their planning. While that goes on, they've got recruitment going for the people who will carry out the operation. They do their funding to pay for these. They procure their logistics. They have their transportation issues, counterfeit passports, all of those type of things. Then they go through the training aspect, they execute the mission, and then they exploit it with propaganda, and they also have ongoing security. So it's a very well thought out plan. It's not, oh, let's go attack that target, strap a bomb to our chest. There's so much more that goes into it behind the scenes from our adversaries. And for those of you in law enforcement, this is no surprise to you either. The criminal element, I mean, this is the criminal planning cycle, which I'm sure a lot of the law enforcement officers have seen in the room. Very similar to the terrorist cycle. You start with your target selection, ongoing surveillance, planning, continuous surveillance, your deployment, the crime, the escape, and the exploitation. And you know, I mentioned that the world is getting better, is getting safer. There are a couple areas where the world is actually not getting better. And one of the big ones here, as many of you probably know firsthand, is the opioids, poisonings. Poisonings is significantly higher than it ever was 30 years ago. That's obviously been a tremendous problem, as is the human trafficking aspect of it. I'm off to Vietnam in a couple weeks for a human trafficking project. Now, there are more slaves, legitimate slaves, in the world right now than there ever were, 200 some years ago before the Civil War. Slavery exists, and human trafficking is a big part of it. It's incredibly organized. If you've seen the movie Taken with Liam Neeson, that exists. That goes on. People buy and sell people with suitcases of cash like that all the time. The other thing that's really become more sophisticated as well, and I don't know if Martin will touch on this, but certainly he's got the experience, is the kidnapping and ransom aspect of the world as well. Kidnapping used to be that they would just pick somebody off the street and then, call their family for money. Nowadays, the criminals can actually do kidnappings. They can sit in a prison cell in Mexico City, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and carry out kidnapping virtually over a payphone in a prison. I mean, it's incredible the sophistication of these folks. And nothing's immune. It's not just people, but it's infrastructure. We're here to talk about infrastructure today. Seaports obviously is a huge concern. Anything to do with transportation. Our water system. Leo and I worked a project for many years about protecting the nation's water supply. How easy it would be to actually affect a school. Your food supply. A lot of people don't take into consideration how vulnerable our food supplies can be. Electric power, our power grid. Later today in the panel, Chuck Brooks will be here. Chuck is the #1 tech person to follow on LinkedIn. He's the #5 overall person on LinkedIn to follow. He'll be talking about how vulnerable our power grid is if somebody wanted to take that down, particularly in a cyber attack. And then the thing that really scares me is our sports stadiums and our public venues and malls. If you've been to the Middle East, even in a friendly country like Jordan, you go through metal detectors. You go through X-ray screening in the Middle East. in Israel, all of these places. Imagine going to Sarasota Square Mall to go shopping and you have to get patted down and go through a metal detector. That's just a way of life in other parts of the world. So there is a need. How do we tie all of this together? Vulnerability assessments. And that's really what it's all about, is finding a methodology or a system, a process to really make sense of all the chaos that's out there. And to do a vulnerability assessment, or for those who don't know, a vulnerability assessment basically means you're going to go in and from a defensive standpoint, you're going to look and see where are the weaknesses within my campus, my company, my supply chain, those type of things. And enter in now the CARVER methodology. So CARVER, for those who don't know, or if you haven't seen it already, CARVER is an acronym. It stands for their criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, and recognizability. It was created by Leo and his team at the CIA. Leo will give a history of it, so I'm not going to steal any of his thunder of how he did it, but in very brief, it actually started the OSS, the precursor to the CIA back in World War II, when the pilots were deciding where they were going to drop their bombs. They used a system called CARVE. Leo and his team turned it into CARVER, as sort of a predictive methodology, and that started about 1973. You had the Munich Olympics take over there. You had the PLO. You started had a lot of terrorism acts that began in the early 70s. We call the 70s the modern age of terrorism. And the special operations community now is very big on using CARVER. It was used during the bin Laden raid and the planning for that operation. Last week, al-Baghdadi was captured, killed as well. I have no doubt, I can't tell you for sure, but I have no doubt that they probably used the CARVER methodology in the planning for that as well. And again, just so we're all on the same page starting off this morning, criticality, when we talk about that, is the single points of failure within your system. Accessibility, the ease of access for somebody to get to that actual point. The recoverability, if we took that piece offline, how long would it be to recover, get things back and running again? It's funny, in Saudi Arabia, the recoverability on the oil fields out there, when they were hit, they said, oh, we'll be back online in 72 hours. No, I mean, you can say that, but it's still not the case. Vulnerability, the level of exposure. The effect, the scope and magnitude, and that is not always physical, that also is the psychological effects as well. And then finally, the recognizability. Can a bad guy know that that's a weak spot within your system? Okay? And now, what really makes CARVER unique is there's a lot of vulnerability assessments that are out there. There's a lot of people who do this. You get a lot of retired FBI guys who go out and say, yeah, I'll do your assessment. And what they do, and no shame on this, they go out and they say from their experience, from their past experience, this is a vulnerability, that fence needs to be higher, so on and so forth. But a lot of it is very subjective. It's based upon that person's experience. He may be an expert in weapons, but maybe not an expert in explosives or biological or something. So you're going to have some trade-offs along the way in knowledge. There may be some knowledge gaps. Also, when they write a report, they may say, oh, the facility over there, we give it a score of low. So low, medium, high threat. Well, what does that really mean, low, medium, high? I mean, that's pretty vague. So what CARVER does is it actually gives you a hard number. It gives you a hard percentage of what we call the probability of attack. The other thing it does, it also helps you rack and stack your assets. A lot of people never even know what their assets are until they go out and do an assessment, what they actually own. And how they score that in a priority. Like we said, it gives you quantitative results. It justifies your budgets. How many times have you had a boss or come to you and say, okay, what's the security budget? And you say, well, it's going to be $10 million. And they're like, $10 million? No, we need that money for something else. Security is a non-revenue generating entity. It doesn't bring in money. It's a liability on the balance sheet. And there's a saying in the security world that, security's always too much until there's an incident. And then it's never enough. And then there's a knee-jerk reaction, money's thrown at it, and money is misspent. So what CARVER does is it gives you a justification to people who don't know security of why you need to spend or put things in a certain place. It tests your response capabilities. And then finally, it identifies the needs of people who need to be trained, whether your own people or outsiders or other people on your team. And really, this is not a new idea. This goes back. You can't have a security presentation without throwing in a Sun Tzu slide. I'm always guilty of this. So it goes back to the whole know thyself. Sun Tzu said, if you know yourself and you know your enemies, you will win every battle. Most people know themselves, but they don't know their enemies, so they lose half their battles. You don't know yourself or your enemy, you lose every battle. Likewise, there's a lot of preparation that goes on with your vulnerability assessments. Anyone who's been in the military or even the law enforcement folks know that what? No plan survives first contact. First time a bullet's fired, that plan you've got goes out the window and you're in full improvisation mode. So Eisenhower had it right that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. As Churchill said as well, he who fails to plan is planning to fail. But aside from these great men, there is one philosopher that I've always adhered to more than any other, and that's the philosopher Mike Tyson, who said that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that's the reality for all of us who've worked in a first responder role is everybody thinks there's a plan, or yeah, that's my plan on the shelf, some booklet gathering dust. But when something happens, it really doesn't work. It's outdated. It hasn't been tested. So that's what Carver gives you is this preparation. So people ask me all the time, they say, well, what's next? What's the next threat coming down the road? What do we need to be prepared for? So 10 years ago, and even maybe a little longer than that, Leo and I used to do this chart. And this is a impact versus the likelihood of a threat. And what you'll see here is that obviously, you know, a nuclear weapon is the worst possible thing that could obviously happen. That would have the highest impact. But the likelihood of that is pretty difficult. Nick Waugh, who's be speaking this afternoon, Nick was in charge of all of our nuclear silos and know where all the nukes are. We were joking last night at dinner. He knows under which elementary schools are the old nuclear silos. It's not easy. It's not easy to launch a nuke or a suitcase nuke or any of these type of things. So that was 10 years ago. Today, this is what this likelihood chart looks like. We've added to it cyber attacks, active shooters, and vehicular attacks, meaning that there's a huge impact of it, and the likelihood it's much easier for the adversary to carry out these type of attacks. This is today. My prediction for the future are three additional things that we'll start to see over the next 5 to 10 years. The first one for me is what we call the traditional human operations. We have gotten away from traditional human intelligence, and we as the United States, where other countries have really excelled at it. Countries like Russia, countries like China, countries like Iran have gone back to using old school traditional intelligence recruitment techniques. What does this mean? Blackmail, coercion, getting people in compromising positions, our own political leaders. I mean, there's things out there that can be done to sway things in other people's advantage. You remember Anna Chapman from a few years back. Anna Chapman was the Russian spy. Her job literally was to sleep her way into the White House. She got pretty close to some very, very senior people in our government, just being a beautiful spy. She was traded back to the Russians in a spy swap. Now she's a massive celebrity back in Russia. And if you ever heard, for those who worked in the intel world, you always hear of the acronym MICE. Why do people spy? Why do people give up secrets? Well, it really boils down to four things. Money. Money's usually number one. You give people money, they give you secrets. Ideology. Some people is of that same philosophy. The best example you get for that is, if you remember Ana Montes. Ana Montes was a Cuban-American who worked at the Defense Intelligence Agency. She was giving secrets to the Cuban intelligence service for years. She was arrested right after 9/11. That's why she doesn't get a lot of attention. But she was just doing it for ideological reasons for Cuba. Coercion, pure blackmail. The Russians are the masters of blackmail. If you go to Russia, be very careful. You will get the hotel knock on your door in the middle of the night. Hey, do you want a massage? All this kind of thing, because you will get then videotaped, and the video will be sent back to you in an email saying, hey, how would you like your wife, your church, your boss, everybody to see this video of you and these two lovely Russian girls, unless you pass whatever secrets, whatever stock prices you're working on, procurements, inventions, what have you. It happens all the time. China is getting more and more into this as well. And then the last one is ego. There's a lot of people who spy just because it's sexy. You're overseas, you're in a foreign environment. People are coming up to you and saying, hey, I'll give you some money, but how would you like to be a spy? I'll train you in spy stuff. And you'd be amazed the people who just will give up secrets just for a little adventure in their life. Okay? So that's threat number one. The second threat is, I think, big data technical surveillance and collection. By the way, the DBT up there stands for design basis threats. A design basis threat essentially means whenever you are looking at what your adversary's capabilities are, you write them out. You say, if somebody was going to attack this room today, how would they do it? And you actually map out a little plan. Leo will get into this a little bit later, but there's DBTs for all these potential scenarios, for all these different what-ifs that could happen. So the second what if that I say, big data technical surveillance and collection, is all of our phones, everything we own, everything we do, everything we say, it's being recorded, whether it's your Alexa, your Google, your Fitbit, whatever it is, all this information is being recorded. And it goes to somebody. And I'll give you a great example. If anybody ever uses the go-go in-flight Wi-Fi in the airplane, let's say you're sitting up in business class in seat 2A doing your emails, well, there's a guy in 36G who's reading everything on your screen. It's not that secure. And again, just the world that we live in today, using cafes for internet, using the hotels' internet service, very easy to spoof that, very easy to get in and read everything that's on your computer. And really, what are we today? We are our phone. Our whole life is our phone. If I steal your phone, I pretty much know about 85% of your life and even some of your most intimate secrets. Okay? And then the last thing, which I really is going to be something that we see, I hope we don't, but I don't see it not happening, and that's the drone threat that's out there. Drones, the procurement, the ease of access to drones, you can even make them now in your own 3D printers, has really become something. And you think of just a Saturday afternoon college football game here in the state of Florida. Imagine if somebody, I don't know if I can get this to play or not. Where's our IT guy? Could you just click on the video to play on the screen? I can't seem to do it up here. So this is a video of ISIS. This is ISIS taking munitions and dropping the munitions over a police station in Syria. They've got the camera, so they record this for propaganda purposes. Imagine a Saturday afternoon in Gainesville, in Tallahassee, somebody flies over with a drone and does something like this. Imagine the chaos that we'd have in the United States. And it doesn't even have to be a drone. What if they dropped talcum powder, baby powder, thinking it was anthrax? What are you going to do? Are you going to quarantine that section of the football stadium? People are going to leave. Nobody's going to stay. You could drop a ham sandwich. You're going to cause some kind of disruption. And Leo is our resident bomb expert. He set up the FBI's explosive labs and did all the forensic examinations and everything for all the major bombing cases, including 9/11. He was the senior case agent for 9/11. So Leo this afternoon will be talking about drones and explosives as well, so I don't want to steal any of his thunder. And then lastly here, just so you can see what a Carver chart sort of looks like. Again, tying all of this information, these threats together, racking and stacking your assets here, giving it an asset description, your design basis threat, what somebody could actually do against you, and then measuring it off against criticality, accessibility, recoverability, vulnerability effect, and recognizability, and getting what we call our P sub A, our probability of attack. And then the last thing I will leave you with here, too, is I started with a quote from Benjamin Franklin talking about giving up some liberties for security. And there's another quote from Franklin, which I think is even better, and it's this one here. It's distrust and caution are the parents of security. Basically, that means all of us in this room here, we have a detector when we go out. We see something that's suspicious. Pretty much law enforcement, I think better than any other organization, law enforcement has the ability to see when there's potential threats going on around them or something looks out of place. So I think this really kind of sums it up nicely. Okay, and with that, I think I'm very early here, so we've got plenty of time for questions. Please, somebody. Yes, sir.
Quick question on your first slides about is the work getting better. Do you feel like maybe because of social media and Because of the availability of social media and cell phones everywhere, there's just more of that visible. So we think there's more, but really there wasn't. 30 years ago, it was just not as visible.
Yeah, no, social media plays a tremendous impact for spreading fear, obviously. I mean, but it has some good as well. I think that, nowadays you can't go out and do anything without the fear of getting caught on video, and it's so accessible. And even if there's not a CNN news crew there's somebody who captured it on his phone, who then sends it to CNN, who then spreads it for everybody to see. So social media definitely awakens people. I think a lot of people back in 1988 just didn't realize that there was wars and these other things going on, maybe because they didn't have the access of the internet, wasn't invented yet. People didn't travel as much. International travel now is so easy to get anywhere on the planet. Really, you can get anywhere on the planet in 24 hours now, with the exception of some few islands out in the Pacific. They take a couple days. But absolutely, the internet, social media has really sort of awoken people to what is going on in other parts of the world. And again, I think the media just kind of plays it up. Again, the whole philosophy, if it bleeds, it leads. If somebody died, if there was a volcano, anything like that, it always gets, if there's death, it's always a lead-in. Yeah. Other questions? No other questions?
Just goes to show you how good you cover everything.
And again, we don't want to make this a doom and gloom conference. We really are trying to get away from that. Jenny will be next. Jenny will give you doom and gloom. I gave you the happy stuff up here. Yeah. Huh? Okay, well, great. Well, thank you, everybody. I'll turn it back over to Dave.
We have a great panel discussion coming up. It's going to be moderated by Luke Bencie himself. I'd like to give an introduction to our guests up here. First one is one of the most recognized cybersecurity experts in the U.S., top 5 tech people to follow on LinkedIn. Pretty sure I'm number 249,842. Received 2 senior presidential appointments. Was an auxiliary police officer, held several vice president positions in the private sector, and is the principal market growth strategist, cybersecurity and emerging technologies for General Dynamics Mission Systems, Mr. Chuck Brooks. You can clap, the drones aren't gonna. Chairman and Chief Executive Officer for PICA Corporation and founder, started his career in retail loss prevention with Polo Ralph Lauren, lived and worked in the US, Latin America, and Europe, and has authored many articles and lectured worldwide. He has helped to reorganize troubled companies, prepare companies for public offerings, consulted on mergers and acquisitions from the Ohio State University. Vincent Volpi. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent and expert forensics examiner with over 26 years of experience, specializing in counterterrorism investigations, and was the senior supervisor in charge of all FBI laboratory activities in the 9/11 investigation. It was rumored that CARVER was used on the operation to kill Osama bin Laden. Also rumored that Leo and company really weren't there for the capture of Che Guevara. CARVER certified instructor, Leo West. And now your moderator, Luke Bencie.
Great. Okay, so for this panel, we're trying to keep this very loose. What I thought I would do is I'd ask a couple questions, then we'll turn it back over to the audience for you guys. The idea, though, is we have a cyber expert, again, of 500 million people on LinkedIn. Chuck is pretty much the #1 go-to. I think you're number 5 overall on LinkedIn person that's followed. Leo West, with his experience with explosives, starting the FBI laboratory for that, and also being the lead investigator for the Cole bombing and some of the other Oklahoma City and it was the Cobar Towers as well. And then Vincent from the private sector, being able to give you what's going on in the security from private, much like what Martin was talking about. You're sort of on your own. You don't have the army of the government behind you. But I thought I'd start with Chuck first, because Chuck just flew in literally 90 minutes ago. He landed at Sarasota Airport. He was doing this for AT&T, so he went right from AT&T to right to CARVERCON. But since this is a critical infrastructure conference, can you tell us from a cyber perspective, what do you see as the threats and the concerns of cyber as they relate to critical infrastructure?
Sure, great question. Well, I'll give that some context. Originally, I actually joined the Department of Homeland Security in 2004. I was one of the first people there, and one of the priorities was chem, biological, rad, and nuke explosives. That was basically our mantra. And cybersecurity at the time was sort of an afterthought. And now I look back, 15 years later or so, and cybersecurity is sort of permeating everything we do. And it's become basically because everyone is connected, everything is connected, and we're now experiencing basically all of our commerce and our communications and even a lot of our healthcare through digital means. So what has happened recently in terms of security is that there's a lot to be concerned about, and it's mainly, of course, there's the small businesses and everything else, and personal, identity theft and everything, but critical infrastructure. And critical infrastructure, for the most part in the United States, is antiquated. A lot of it's built in 70s and 80s and 90s, and it wasn't built with security in mind, let alone cybersecurity in mind. So what we're seeing now is a rash of attacks on basically on energy, on financial and healthcare hospitals with ransomware, with phishing attacks. And basically it's become such a big problem that this year the Department of Homeland Security created the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency as part of it. And the role of that whole agency is to focus on working with the private sector, which owns 85% of all the critical infrastructure, to mostly prevent cyber attacks and share threat information. So we're seeing a lot happening now. It's threatening. Much like Martin said, the same avenues that are used for organized crime are being now used for cybersecurity organized crime. So it's a real threat.
And just following up on that, back in the olden days, let's say the 70s and 80s, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have the computer systems we have today. They were run on SCADA systems, the Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition System, the old manual turning the knobs, basically. How is that able to integrate with today's technology? Is it still relevant? Are they being replaced? Are they still in use? And can you hack into these systems?
Well, the answer is they're still in use, and they're easily hackable. Actually, just a couple weeks ago, one of India's nuclear facilities was hacked by someone bringing in malware. And a lot of this also is a people problem. It's not just technology coming from the outside. And the second part of all these SCADA systems is that they also have a lot of identity authorization issues, people leaving back and forth, different networks. So there's always a weak point. So SCADA just has a different set of risk management principles than the rest of corporate, or other infrastructure. But it's very vulnerable, and unfortunately, the consequences of it, when something does happen, let's say if our grid, which is very vulnerable itself, is attacked, could be, cause devastating consequences.
From the audience, any questions while we're talking about the grid? Anybody have anything that they want to jump in on? No? Okay, well, yeah, go ahead, Mark.
So on the, I wouldn't say there's an unwritten rule, but at least among state actors, you see people all the time, countries all the time coming in, and they'll hack each other, they'll even go into corporations, steal data, that type of thing. But there's never really been an episode where a state actor has gone in and stopped a company from doing commerce. Now, how soon or in what time frame do you see some state actor coming into a major corporation and stopping their ability to perform commerce?
Well, the nation-state threat, it's very ominous. And I look particularly at the Chinese, because they have the most resources and effort put into it. And most of it's been to pilfering IP and exfiltrating data files, which they have half of the U.S. government's files for anyone who's held a security clearance. So it's a very frightening scenario. But I think the problem, though, with it's not that it hasn't been used. What you're really talking about is offensive cyber. And offensive cyber was just used by the United States actually against Iran in a good way. It basically debilitated the whole air defense systems and caused ruckus throughout the country. A lot of it is not talked about right now. But I think also that same capability can be done by several countries, of course, Russia, of course, North Korea, China, and others that wanted to destabilize a company or create an issue here. You know, we're at battle right now over Huawei and others on the 5G issue, and I could easily see them taking sort of retribution and trying to destabilize one of our 5G carriers and trying to undermine their capabilities in a global competition, particularly when the whole world's networks are running in 5G.
Point. Other questions, comments? So I'll just follow up on that real quick, and then we'll move along. The Huawei. So the Chinese servers, we no longer in the U.S. government are allowed to use those. Backdoors, what was the sort of the rationale for that?
Well, there's several rationales. One is that they have been accused of spying by several administrations. And the second part is that there's a dependency, because if you're looking at, as we become dependent on their technologies and their networks, they're able to take and steal all of the information going through it, whether it be classified, whether it be business IP, everything. We have created dependency. So there's a lot of activity happening. And in fact, a gentleman from the National Security Council, General Robert Spalding, actually leaked a memo a few years ago about the dire threat of the Chinese domination of 5G, primarily through Huawei and Alibaba and others. And this has now become a major concern, and now the administration is looking at it. It's sort of a bipartisan issue because everyone realizes the implication and threat to not just the security of the United States, but also to business.
So since we're talking about China and commerce, I'm going to jump over Leo for a second and go to Vincent. So Vincent, you deal with the Chinese threat, particularly intellectual property theft and everything the Chinese are doing. How do you see it from your clients in the commercial world of the Chinese getting in and stealing their intellectual property, and how does that relate to sort of the way you see things going in the future?
So, first of all, it's hard to get excited about counterfeit purses and T-shirts and other forms of intellectual property when people talk about intellectual property and the counterfeiting of products. Until you start doing a deeper dive, and that deeper dive is going to lead me back to China here in a minute. At the end of the day, we are an innovation economy. We export something close to $50 billion worth of intellectual property-related products a year. I'm not talking about actual production of products. I'm talking about ideas, entertainment, copyrights, music. We are participating in a huge global economy that's worth $1.7 trillion as it relates to an economic dependency from our government as it relates to our economy and the funding of our capitalist society. The Chinese are turning that back on us by their Belt and Road philosophy, which is basically to move into as many different marketplaces as possible throughout the world by basically the Belt, which is actually roads, and the road, which is actually the seas. And they're building ports and roads and infrastructure all over the world in order to not only exert influence, but to increase their global commerce. As part of the production of their global commerce, they are involved in stealing our intellectual property. And again, intellectual property is patents, trademarks, copyrights. A lot of people think in either one term or another. They think about that counterfeit purse, or they think in terms of somebody going in and stealing state secrets for jet airplanes and things of that nature. But it's both. It's all of the above. And the threats are maybe somewhat different as it relates to the counterfeit purse than the jet airplane. But at the end of the day, they're both undermining the fabric of our society. And it's a state-sponsored effort to accomplish this. And they're doing it in a plethora of different ways that Luke can address probably better than I can insofar as economic espionage. But the upshot is that this money is going back to China to undermine us. It goes to organized criminal organizations. It speaks to some of what Martine was talking about insofar as funding the criminal groups that do human trafficking, money laundering. Terrorism is a big thing as it relates to intellectual property crimes. Al-Qaeda, for example, is involved in counterfeiting of products. They actually produced a manual, I think in Afghanistan it was found, on one of the raids in Afghanistan, where they were encouraging people in their organization to engage in counterfeiting because it's so lucrative. In fact, it's more lucrative than drugs. And it's also has lesser consequences as it relates to being prosecuted. So at the end of the day, it's a great way to fund any criminal organization or any criminal enterprise, and Al-Qaeda and related organizations, Hezbollah in Paraguay, for example, is utilizing the counterfeiting of merchandise and the profits therefrom to fund terrorism. And so when you kind of connect all the dots, all roads lead to China insofar as the production of counterfeit goods. So China is, I think, accountable for almost 60% of all counterfeit goods in the world. Hong Kong is a close second, and obviously part of China now. But at the end of the day, it's these philosophies, this infrastructure that they're building that is undermining and funding a lot of what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis here in the United States of America. So it's a different type of threat that's both commercial and criminal.
Well, and Martin touched on it, and you just brought it up again, too. A lot of people don't recognize that in our hemisphere here in Latin America, you talked about Ecuador, you talked about the tri-border area. I think a lot of people don't understand what actually happens in the tri-border and what that even looks like, or can you just describe it a little bit?
Okay, so the tri-border area is the area that's bounded by Paraguay, Brazil, and Bolivia. And it is a very, very small country, Paraguay, but they transit and produce probably more counterfeit goods in Latin America than any country. The former president of Paraguay had cigarette factories, and he was producing counterfeit cigarettes and distributing them all throughout Latin America, and some exfiltrated into the United States, smuggled into the United States. I think he had something like, had dozens of factories that were being utilized in order to fund criminal enterprise, in this case his own family criminal enterprise. But the counterfeit activity that occurred in Paraguay, has historically been connected to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has used that money to fund, for example, various terrorist attacks around the world. The first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center was funded by the sale of counterfeit merchandise, counterfeit T-shirts, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, so it all ties together. I'll pause for a second. Anybody questions from the audience? We're going along.
I just have one comment. Leo and I have done a lot of counterintelligence vulnerability assessments, and instead of security, physical security, we've done counterintelligence vulnerability assessments. And of course, China has come up at the top of the list on every one of them. And it turns out that if you're Chinese, you're expected to provide intelligence back to the homeland. Whether you're an American citizen or you're just over here visiting, you're an exchange student in college, do you still see that? I mean, everything's going back home.
So, just happen to have an article here that is pretty relevant and pretty current. This is from the Harvard Crimson. It was originally published in the New York Times. And there's currently an investigation by the NIH, National Institute of Health, relative to Chinese and Chinese-American researchers at Harvard exfiltrating information to the Chinese government through academic exchanges. Now, the whole issue of academia and the collaboration on research projects and joint ventures and symposia, because the academic community functions as a kind of an open community, is an advantage that China is taking us to the nth degree, because our institutions, educational institutions, are becoming more internationally focused. They're going out there looking for international students, looking for international revenues. They're out there establishing schools overseas. And so that world is getting bigger at the same time that the world itself is getting smaller. So there's more engagement on the academic level. And the Chinese are leveraging this against us. They're sending their children to our schools. They're getting advanced degrees. They're getting involved in research projects. And they're exfiltrating that information back to the homeland. And they have to do it for reasons that you know. They got relatives back there. They've got interests or assets back there. I mean, they came with the intention of doing it, or somewhere along the way they've been corrupted into the project.
Well, and that brings up the case, too, if we're talking about academia, of what's known as the Confucius Centers. And if you're not familiar with that, it's something definitely to Google. I know that USF maybe even had a little issue with the Confucius Center. I won't go down that road. But just to say that the Chinese government has been believed to actually set up these centers at universities. And what they do is they go into the university and they say, oh, we at the embassy here, we would like to donate X amount of dollars to set up a Confucius Center. And what that means is we'll teach you about Chinese history, and if kids want to come and learn the language and everything of Chinese, you know, we'll offer these opportunities and we'll fund all of it. Well, what that does is it acts as a recruiting ground. It's a great intelligence ploy that they set it up. They're able to identify students who they believe could have sympathies or could pass something back. And, you know, this might be for a separate lecture, but there is this belief in academia, as Vincent was saying, that academia, you trade information. There's no secrets in academia. A professor in Beijing should have the same access to information as a professor here, which is fine, but there's all these exchanges that go on, and there's targeting, and a lot of times academic institutions will win government grants to work on a government project, a DoD project, and what happens is, using that guise of academics share information, you may have a foreign government, a foreign academic institution come to the American institution and say, oh, hey, we'd like to learn about, or can you provide a paper or information or something that you're doing? So it's sort of a back door that's been happening. And the Confucius Centers are slowly, they've been spread throughout Latin America as well, but they're slowly getting kicked out of the United States because they're found to have this espionage angle to them. But I want to switch to Leo now, going back to physical threats. And when I called Leo up, Leo really is the preeminent guy when it comes to explosives and bombing attacks. And when I said, Leo, you know, do you want to come talk about explosives? He said, you know, I can talk explosives all day, but my concern is drones. I see that being a threat, and we talked about that briefly. Why do you believe drones are the big emerging threat out there?
Well, part of the reason I thought we ought to talk a little bit about drones is because they really haven't been in the news much for the last year or so. If you think about it, you know, back during the height of the war against ISIS a year or two ago, you saw a lot of video footage and news coverage about them using drones to drop munitions and so on, similar to the video clip that Luke had showed earlier today. But over the last year, they've really been kind of out of the news because, in part, ISIS has been more or less, you know, rendered somewhat inoperable. And so I thought, you know, maybe it's a good time just to bring it up again, the subject of drones and the potential for misuse and terrorist activity and so on, to kind of be a little reminder to us to kind of keep that on our list of potential threat vectors and so on. You know, there's a double-edged sword there, really, with drones, because they've got so many good uses as well, you know, for public safety, you know, police and fire, search and rescue, agriculture is making a big use of drones and so on. There's a lot of positive uses of drones, but at the same time, it has potential for some bad actors' usage. Here in this country, for instance, the DHS and FBI and authorities keep a pretty good track of reportings of drone sightings and misuse of drones and so on. And it really doesn't revolve so much around criminal or terrorist activities now, at least in this country. It's more the what you might call the disruptive enthusiast who wants to break the rules and fly into no-fly spaces or restricted airspaces and so on to get that perfect photo or that extra video footage or whatever it might be. And a good example of that is what happened here just recently in California with the firefighting. The last couple of weeks, you guys, I'm sure, have seen all the efforts to try to control the fires out there. And one of the problems they had on several days was overflights by drones, enthusiasts wanting to capture footage of whatever, the firefighting or the fires themselves, and interfering with the flight of the helicopters and aircraft doing the firefighting. So if you will, disruptive enthusiast, as the DHS labels them, is a big problem. But likewise, terrorists and criminals also are an issue. The criminals, of course, in terms of possibly smuggling contraband into prisons or across borders, narcotics and so on. The terrorists using them to have as a weapons platform or to drop munitions, things like that. And of course, foreign intelligence services as well for espionage, be it against government or corporate espionage. The drones, as you might call them, or unmanned aerial systems, have a lot of potential for that. And the reason I thought this is something we should keep in mind and maybe have as a little topic is because what it's really done is kind of changed our traditional views of physical security and so on from a two-dimensional, where we're looking at things on the ground where we've got to worry about perimeter security and gates and locks and access points and guards and so on, to really a three-dimensional, because we've got this airspace above us now that we really have a difficult time controlling. So it's changed the whole look, in a sense, of what we need to do in terms of physical security.
And are there technologies or services, solutions out there to defeat what is the government or what can companies do to protect themselves?
Well, there's actually a number of technologies. One of the things that's already in place, and I don't know if some of you here in the public safety arena are using drones here in the Sarasota, Bradenton area. And if you are, please correct me if I'm wrong or speak up. But I know one of the techniques has been what they call geofencing. And if you're not familiar with that, that's basically where software is included in the programs of the UAS or drone to limit where it can go. In other words, to prevent it from going into no-fly zones. And also, in some respects, to limit its ability to go at a certain speed or to go to a certain altitude and so on. So that geofencing is a new, relatively new method of controlling them. In fact, all of the manufacturers now are paying attention to that, and DJI, for instance, which is one of the, in fact, it is the largest manufacturer of commercial and enthusiast drones, actually has geofencing built into it for all of the airports in the United States, the prisons, and nuclear facilities. And certain other ones are as well, other manufacturers. Of course, there's always a but. There's also companies out there that are manufacturing software to defeat that. One Russian company called COPTERware has got, for just a few $100s, item of software that you can obtain, which will do away with any geofencing or speed limitations or altitude limitations. And there's other types of software like that as well. And then obviously another thing that can be done to get around the geofencing is, if the bad guy has the wherewithal and the knowledge, is to build his own drone without anything in it. You can buy the parts and assemble it, or you can use 3D printing. there's a variety of means that you can use to build your own drone without any limitations. So that's probably the primary method right now that's available and in pretty widespread use, particularly here in the U.S. There's other types of technologies as well. Radar, of course. Radar, as you know, will detect moving objects in that. One of the problems, though, is then determining whether that's a bird or that's a balloon that somebody let loose or whatever. So you've got some issues with the radar. Radio frequency sniffers is another one. That's a type of technology that is available that will help track the radio waves of the controller back and forth to the drone as it's moving. One of the issues there is that in looking at the frequencies, there's also a feature that allows what they call frequency hopping, where depending upon the location of the drone at any given point, it will switch frequencies automatically to stay in contact with the controller. And here again, of course, if they want to turn the frequencies, or excuse me, I should say the transmitter off, there won't be any radio waves. They can just operate by waypoints with GPS. So that has some limitations as well. There's also thermal and acoustic detection sensors that can be used. And those are actually pretty good in a sense because they can differentiate between, say, a bird or an aircraft, unlike radar. Although even here again, there's certain limitations with them. For instance, with acoustic, where you get into a more urban environment, you've got a lot of background noise and other things that can mask, you know, what type of an object that you're seeing. So there's issues with all of these things, and a lot of research is being done. There's research being done now with certain types of what they call temporal frequency analysis, where they pair, and Angus, you may be familiar with this, as far as taking high-resolution videography and pairing it with machine learning, and they can get very good resolution and high-speed images of the drone or object in question, and again, discern whether it's a bird or somebody's plastic bag that got away from them, blew up in the air, whatever it is. So all of these areas are being considered and looked at. There's no one perfect answer. The geofencing is probably the most common of these right now, but there's a lot of research that's going on in the background and so on, and that's another reason why I think it's important to maybe kind of keep it in the news and uppermost in our minds as far as security personnel in staying in touch with the manufacturers of security equipment and detection equipment and so on, because frankly, that's our best chance of mitigating or dealing with the UAS, is to try to detect it. Once it's actually overhead, then we're very limited because of the fact that we have a variety of laws and regulations which regulate how we can deal with it when it is overhead. I'm sure you remember there's been some things over the years where people have tried to shoot it down or other things. Well, you can't just do that. And there's a federal law in the books, for instance, in Title 18 of the U.S. Code for anyone who willfully damages or destroys an aircraft. And if you use a net or a shotgun or something like that to try to bring down a drone, you can be in a lot of hot water. So there's a lot of issues with it, but yeah.
Well, I had seen a study 2 years ago. I forget which agency did this, if it was FAA or somebody. They took the top 200 counter-drone solutions and they ranked them for effectiveness. Do you know what the #1 solution for counter-drone was out of these 200 technologies? It was hawks wearing shin guards. That was the most effective solution, is to train birds to go after a drone in the air, and then they get a little snack when they knock it down to the ground. So I think the technology still,
Yeah.
is still a ways off
Right.
now. And Congress has been kicking this down the road for a while too.
Right, right. And that's the thing, I think, and part of it too goes back to the nature of our laws and you know, the way our thought process is here in the United States with the freedom and independence and so on from government interference. When you're talking about doing something like jamming or electronic interference with a drone and bringing it down, just like the nets or anything else, you really have a lot of issues because it's not your airspace. I mean, there's a thought that, you know, that's my house, my castle, everything on it and above it is mine. Well, that's not true. The airspace throughout the United States is not owned by anyone other than us as a nation. It's owned and controlled by the U.S. government. You don't own your own airspace. It doesn't matter what type of facility you have. So a lot of people just don't realize that, and I think, again, that's the type of thing that needs to be maybe brought forward more and more attention brought to as we go down this road and we see more and more drones. And again, part of the reason I'm thinking it's an issue that's going to grow is because of the increased numbers. For instance, in 2016, there were 2.5 million sales of drones here in the United States, you know, to commercial and private users and so on. It's projected that next year, 2020, there'll be over 7 million sales. So the numbers are just growing and growing. And I'm sure you probably saw here in the last couple of weeks, Amazon had their first formal delivery of a package by drone. So it's a coming issue. I mean, we've got it here now, but in the future, I think it's only going to get bigger and of more concern to us.
Any questions? We're going to move on.
Thank you for that. As an airport, that's the biggest threat we have now is the drone. It's not necessarily because of an accident. It's just the economic terrorism. As we've seen in London, just the threat and the short burst of drones going up before aircraft takeoff just stops everything. So if it's calculated properly, like around a holiday, you have hundreds of thousands of people trying to leave somewhere, and they'll spend 2 days at an airport that's paralyzed completely from just one drone. So that's the biggest threat we have, and the technology is there for detecting the drones, but like you mentioned, the FAA in their wisdom call their aircraft, so now we cannot hijack them or disrupt them because it's considered an aircraft. So hopefully the laws will change and the vision on it will change, but in the meantime, this is what we're faced with.
Right, right. That you're speaking about the Gatwick incident? Yeah, yeah. And that's just one of the, I guess you would call it, evil capabilities of drone usage. Again, you've got the weapons platform. If you remember a few years ago, there was a YouTube going around of somebody who I think it had a 45 automatic rigged up as a payload to a drone, and he could actually fire it from the drone as he was flying it. Of course, IEDs, you know, we've seen that over the last couple of years. The potential to drop a chemical weapon. In fact, one of the first terrorist uses of drones was an attempt by Shinriko in 1994. I don't know if you recall, that was the terrorist group that had made its own sarin. They actually had some model helicopters that they were trying to use to spray the sarin. Now, their experimentation didn't work out, and they switched to just doing it manually on a train. If you remember, they put it in some bags and then had sharpened umbrellas that they pierced the bags with. But it's again, something that's been tried, and the WMD aspect of a weapons delivery system is a real threat. The radioactive material, I think we were talking about earlier, I think Jenny may have mentioned or something, the potential there, or even just to create a public disturbance or disruption and harassment. For instance, somebody flies over a stadium with a bag of talcum powder and drops the talcum powder. What are you going to do with all those people? Do you quarantine them? What kind of panic is that going to create, and so on? There's a host of those things that the bad actors can do, aside from the cyber and foreign intelligence services with corporate espionage and that type of thing. And because of that and the kind of evolving nature of this, DHS and the FBI and FAA have come up with a variety of steps or recommendations to try to help deal with it and mitigate it. And I don't know if you want to get into that or...
Yeah, we've got a few minutes if you just
Yeah.
want to mention a couple of the steps.
Yeah, let me see here. I've got them. I can't remember them all myself, so I have to read them to you. But just to give you an idea, some of the general recommendations. Of course, first off, you have to know the domain around your facility and who has authority to take action to either improve the security or in place some sort of security. Another general recommendation they make is to be in touch with the counter UAS providers, that is the researchers and vendors and so on, to learn what type of materials are out there or counter UAS equipment and so on, and what is viable or not viable. I think, again, as we spoke of earlier in the day, there's a lot of vendors out there who have solutions for things that are really not worth the money and just basically a waste. So you have to do some research and follow up on it. You want to stay in touch with the local law enforcement and public safety and other stakeholders to confer with them on how to deal with it, consider some cross-training and so on, and information sharing. Let's see what else here. Let's see.
That's all
But
right.
it says, yeah, go ahead. I'm
Push
sorry.
on.
Yeah.
Well, let me, I just want to switch gears just because I know we're a little bit pressed for time. But I want to go back to Chuck here. So about, I guess, 6 months ago, 9 months ago, Elon Musk did an interview. And they asked Elon Musk what he thought the greatest threat to the world was. And Elon Musk thought that we were all going to die from robots, artificial intelligence taking over. He said that's the greatest threat. Can you explain to us, Chuck, for those who are novice here, what is the threat from artificial intelligence? Is there one? And what about this Internet of Things that's coming as well?
Sure. That's a topic of big debate among the thinkers, Elon Musk being one of them. It's really a question of how far we're advanced. Right now, artificial intelligence is more of a name than an ability. It's mostly machine learning right now. We have the ability to mimic and understand from learning actions from machine to machine, but there's no sentient thinking yet with artificial intelligence. You know, having said that, there's a lot of investment and money going into it, including DARPA, who's just put $2 billion into it, so they must believe there's something coming on. And then there's a fear. There's a fear because they've already proven that there's biases. Does it create a scenario, if you're going back to 2001, Stanley Kubrick's movie, where you have a HAL 3000, you know, get jealous and kill an astronaut? Or do they have, you know, anything's possible. But I think I disagree with Elon Musk. In this next couple decades, I think we're going to make tremendous gains in artificial intelligence, but I don't think we're going to create a robotic capability that's going to think on its own and be able to take over the world. However, that's not, you know, to say it won't happen 50 years from now. And speaking of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Things is here. We have now upwards of 25 billion connected devices, and it's supposed to get to 50 billion by year 2022, according to Cisco, and over 45 trillion sensors. So we're talking about basically a scenario where we are almost like being matrixed as a world where everything we do will be done digitally and monitored and surveilled and controlled. So, you know, whether it be smart cities that it turns into, or your transportation, your energy is regulated, whether you drive through automated cars. So the world is going through a transformational period, and I think we're just seeing the beginning of it. And it's really important. what Luke just said, because you have to look at the philosophical implications of this as a civilization, as people, what we control and can't control. And even more importantly, I think we have to look at what our adversaries are doing. And how much are they investing? What are they building? What are they doing? Russia is building robotic soldiers right now. I mean, they have limited capability, but they're still, eventually will be able to be operated on a global cloud and with 5G download information commands immediately. So we're not that far off. So it is a brave new world.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask each of you now just quickly what you think is the biggest threat or the biggest concern moving forward. Vincent, I'll ask you first. Biggest threat to corporations over the coming years, biggest corporate security threats you see?
Okay, so from my perspective, it's all about the supply chain and the distribution channels. I'm increasingly concerned about the weaponization of our supply chains and distribution channels by terrorists or bad actors in general. We saw that going way back to the first Tylenol poisoning scare, which is what introduced aseptic packaging. A lot of people in this room probably don't remember that because they were too young. But at the end of the day, pharmaceuticals and most products that we consume have some sort of protective packaging, tamper-proof packaging. And at this point in time, given the fact that our supply chains are increasingly globalizing and our distribution is increasingly globalizing, I think that one of the biggest emerging threats could be that somebody takes advantage of this, figures out that it's relatively easy to introduce toxic substances into the supply chain. This happens pursuant to counterfeiting a lot. There's a lot of counterfeit pharmaceuticals in the industry, for example, out there that, I mean, people make willfully, knowing that there's either no active ingredients or even ingredients that can harm you, that are either as a result of just trying to increase profits or sometimes accidental contamination. So adulteration of products in the supply chain, especially as it relates to consumables, as it relates to anything technological that might affect an aircraft, for example. I think those are some of the threats of the future that we need to be cognizant of.
Leo, in 2029, what's the FBI? What are they going to be working on?
Robots.
Well, I would think that, as we were both talking about earlier here, the cyber and intellectual property threat and so on, I think that has potential to just as big as it is now to get even worse and kind of balloon. And to bring it back a little bit to the drone thing, here again, the bad actors, be it corporate espionage by foreign intelligence services or others, can take those drone capabilities and use them to hack into systems, as far as security advice and so on. If a drone's detected, you need to keep the blinds shut on your windows, turn off the projectors and turn off the monitors, and that whole area of hacking and intelligence gathering and spying, espionage, I think, is going to be a major concern for all of law enforcement.
Okay. And then, Chuck, in 2029, will any of us have any privacy left?
I don't think we have any privacy now, but yeah, it's doubtful. I mean, with facial recognition and everything else. And just one quick thing on threats that scares me most is the automation of these threats to cyber, with machine learning and artificial intelligence coming on track, to be able to basically have the bad guys, just trigger attacks repeatedly and not even having to be there, particularly against low-hanging fruit like hospitals that can take out whole networks and systems, is very frightening.
Okay. Any last-minute questions from anyone in the audience for the panel? Yes, sir.
What is the #1 thing that small businesses in the United States can do from a cybersecurity threat? Just helping out the entire process there. So if they have to do one thing, what is the best thing that they can do?
I think that's an easy one that goes back to Carver. They need to create a risk management plan. They have to define their risks and goals as a business and what they do and what they need to protect. And the only way you can do that is start from the basics and know where your vulnerabilities are, where your assets are, and then devise a system of concentric circles, as our other speaker said, around them. So risk management is really the key.
Anybody else? Carlos?
So kind of tying to what he said, nowadays there's a lot of apps on phones and things like that. How can we be certain that, whatever we download, whatever amount of small information that we put in on these apps does not hurt us later on?
I could just say, I mean, there is there are some basic rules, cyber hygiene. If you don't know where the source is, definitely don't download it. Don't open attachments on emails. Phishing is still the #1 threat. And you could, if you're really involved with cyber, follow the threat incident reports through DHS and see what's out there, but it's too much to follow. But continually patch, whatever your phone sends you. Make sure it's updated, because their job is to make sure that at least what's on the system to detect it and be able to mitigate it. But it's a real problem, because there's so many apps being created every day. They say 46,000 malware apps created a day, so it's difficult to keep pace.
I can add a little
Yeah,
something to
go
that.
ahead.
In Latin America, we have a saying that you never lend your phone to anybody, because there's a lot of espionage through phones in Latin America, and a lot of ways that you go about introducing those apps is by letting somebody use your phone, or leaving your phone unattended, or without any sort of code to keep people out.
Yeah, for U.S. government, if your device, whether it be a phone, a laptop, anything electronic, is left unattended for more than 5 minutes, it's considered compromised and can't be used again or has to be sanitized.
I'd like to make one comment. I went to Brazil to do some work for Luke. And while I was down there, Luke had me draw money out of the ATM because he needed cash to pay some of the people down there. So
That sounds so bad, Leo.
no, it was an easy, quick way to get some funds.
There's no credit cards done. Everything has to be done in cash there.
Yeah, so I had an ATM card that worked down there, and I used it a couple of times. Well, I got back to the States here, and I kept seeing these $500 charges coming up on my bank account. And I talked to the bank. Of course, they refunded everything. But what happened was, they said somebody walked up behind me with a little briefcase and read everything in my wallet. And come to find out, that's very doable nowadays, even here in the United States. So I ended up getting one of the wallets with the tinfoil and everything else in them, which I can't go through airport security with. But the point is, I never even thought of this. Was 4 or 5 years ago. Never even thought of it. But yeah, electronic capture of your mag strips on your credit cards.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming out for this. We actually have awards for you as well that David will get, and one special one actually for Vincent at the end. We have appreciation awards, obviously. I love working with Chuck and Leo, but Vincent was voted this year as the security professional for CARVERCON because he uses Carver. He uses it all over the world, Latin America, Middle East, and everything. So we decided this year for a special award for Vincent as well. So big hand. Yeah.